The story of the big burly lumberjack dude who's the new women's weightlifting champion in Canada actually inspires hope in me rather than the usual contempt. Why? Because as more and more of these things happen, and more men show that they're the best women in their respective sports, finally someone will come to their senses and make it so that there are only actual women in women's sports. Granted, that should have happened long ago, but sometimes it takes a critical mass of ludicrous things to tip people over the edge into a mood actually to do something that finally makes some sense. This is Dr. Avenir. And they make you really upset and angry if you're any kind of a man or if you're any kind of anyone who values decency. And there's stories like this. A man goes and says that he's a woman and decides that he's going to compete in some women's sporting event. And then he goes into that sporting event and absolutely dominates the sporting event and breaks any records that have already been established by the women who used to compete in that sporting event in years past and things like that. And you look at that and you go, that's not fair, that's wrong. This is a biological man, and we always put that qualifier before man, a biological man. Well, of course, every man is a biological man, every woman is a biological woman. You don't really need the word biological, but the point is it's a man, and he's bigger and he's stronger and he's faster and he's all the things that men are, they're much more all these things than women are. And so he's competing in these sporting events and he's winning and he's setting records, and these are records now that if they stand in years to come, it will say only that in all these women's sports, and typically they're swimming events or they're track and field events, in all these women's sports, the holder of the record is an actual man, which of course makes no sense. Now you may say, why does this particular type of story actually hearten me a little bit rather than causing me angst and displeasure? And the answer is fairly simple. It's possibly these things that will finally be, I don't want to say the death knell for feminism, because feminism is a fraud, but it will be the thing that shows feminism for the fraud that it is and allows feminism. Feminism has some good aspects to it. Maybe this will get rid of the bad aspects. And one of the bad aspects of feminism is the pretense that women and men are the same, and that anything a man can do, a woman can do, or anything, and of course it used to be anything a man can do, a woman can do better. And we all remember the joke about Fred Astaire, the famous dancer, Hollywood dancer, and his wife Ginger Rogers. And Fred Astaire was very nimble, and they used to say, you never heard about Ginger Rogers, you always heard about Fred Astaire, but Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in heels. And that was supposed to make us all laugh and go, women are always so much better at all these things than men are, when they simply are not. So now I'm referring, I know this is a bit disjointed, and I apologize, but now I'm going to take you to Canada. And in Canada, this big, burly Canadian man, I mean, he's just a big, burly Canadian man, looks like a lumberjack, big barrel-chested burly dude, beard and mustache, and he's a weightlifter. And I guess he's a weightlifting coach, so I think he's a retired weightlifter. But anyway, he declared that he himself now is a woman. And for the purposes of going into a women's competition, weightlifting competition, he declared himself to be a woman. And because we don't deny these people who declare themselves to be women, we don't deny them their chance to participate in women's sports, in he goes, and he smashed the record, whatever the weightlifting record was, whatever the weightlifting event was, who knows what it was, a deadlift, press, who knows. Anyway, he smashed it by either 100 pounds or 100 kilograms. Not quite sure which system Canada uses, but of course it's significant because 100 kilograms is more than twice what 100 pounds is. But let's call it 100 pounds. Anyway, he smashed the record by quite a bit. The significance of that was that the previous record was held by a, quote, trans woman, unquote. In other words, it was held by a man. And that record smashed the previous record held by an actual woman, not a pretend woman. That record beat the previous record by quite a bit. So now this other big burly guy goes in there and smashes the record held by the fake woman by 100 pounds. A massive smashing of the record. And that should finally show that women and men are significantly different. It should put to rest this whole thing about, women need to get the same pay in the sport as men do. Well, okay, if they need to get the same pay, they need to bring in the same audiences, they need to be able to compete at the same level that men do, at least at a level that will bring in the audiences that that men do, and they don't. They do in some sports, for instance in tennis, and because they bring in big audiences in tennis, they get paid about the same as men do in tennis. But they don't bring in the same audiences in basketball. They don't even bring the same audiences in lingerie football, which I'm not quite sure what they call it now, but it's not lingerie football. But the point is, these are scantily dressed women who get out there, and by the way, they're women in terrific shape. I've seen some of these lingerie football matches, and they're women in tremendous shape, very, very attractive, and they get out there and they on a small football field, and they play what looks a lot like football. And this doesn't bring in the audiences either, because it's just not real football. And of course, basketball, good grief. And soccer, well, the women's soccer, the world champion women's soccer team from the United States couldn't beat an under 15 boys soccer team. So there's a good reason why women's soccer does not bring in the audiences that men's soccer does. And hence why they really shouldn't get paid what the men get paid. In the case of women's soccer, they actually get paid more than the men get paid. And there's no good reason for that. But the bottom line is that the only reason women's sports are here is because men allow them to be. If you look at all the men's sports leagues, all the major men's sports leagues, I believe even the college men's sports leagues, none of them prohibit women from participating or from playing on those men's teams. None of them. And yet, all of the same level women's leagues, women's professional leagues, women's college leagues, prohibit men from playing on the teams, playing on those sports teams, but they don't prohibit, quote, trans women, end quote. In other words, men who claim that they're women, or as I like to call them, fake women, pretend women. So the women's leagues have this little loophole that does not prohibit pretend women, fake women, from playing on the women's sports teams. And more, these fake women, who are just men, are starting to take over these sports. They're starting to dominate them. They're starting to set all the records. Look at Leah Thomas in swimming. If you lived in Connecticut, you saw recently that in high school, 2 young, quote, trans women, end quote, competed in a bunch of women's track and field events and just absolutely dominated them. These were things like sprinting and basically running events. And in those running events, they outclassed or outsprinted or outran the women by significant margins, thereby denying, presumably, the women who finished further back in the pack, denying them scholarships to college, potential professional opportunities, and all sorts of other things that these women ought to have by virtue of the fact that they excel in women's sports. Not the trans women who were just mediocre men. They never did anything all that great on the men's side of things, and all of a sudden decided that they're women, and now they go and absolutely dominate the women's leagues. So I think what we need, honestly, and it's a sad thing because people are just failing to take common sense into account, but I think what we need is, say, some larger name, some higher profile men, just to say, you know what, I'm now over the hill for the men's competitions, so I'm just going to declare myself a woman and add an extra 5-10 years to my career, take home a whole bunch of records, and then, as I said, pretty soon, if this trend were to continue, you would look in the future at all the women's records for all the major sports, golf and tennis and things like that, and you realize that they're all held by men. And when a bunch of old, over-the-hill, faded men prove that they're the best women in the world at their sport, you'll see how fast things will change, and we'll stop pretending that men can be women and women can be men. Because, let's face it, that's never been true, and it never will be true. Can we now bring some common sense back into this? Stop pretending that men and women are the same. Let women have their sports. Let's not pretend that they're as good as men at these sports, because they're not. They're not as strong, they're not as fast, they're not as big. Bodies are configured dramatically differently. Let's just let women have their sports, and let's stop with the pretense. And then we could actually have some common sense, and feminism would get a very strong dose of reality given to it. I've always noticed that in watching women's sports, you get these very strange, when you're listening to the announcers, you get these very strange announcements. For instance, I used to love to watch women's golf, and some young woman would get up there and absolutely tattoo the ball right down the center of the fairway off the tee. Just a beautiful tee shot. And you'd hear the announcers talking about how she really clobbered it, and that was great length, and it was just, she absolutely hammered the ball, and about what a long shot it was, and she's one of the long hitters on the tour. And then you find out that she hit it 230 yards. Well, when I was first taking up golf and I was 45 years old. I was hitting it 230 yards, rarely down the center of the fairway, but when I straightened things out, I would hit it consistently 250, 260, 270 yards, roughly, somewhere in the fairway, not with the control that the best women golfers have, but I'd outdrive them by 30, 40, 50 yards. And the announcers were treating these women as if they were absolutely murdering the ball. And then you'd watch the guys go up there and they'd hit the ball 330 yards, 340 yards, outdriving the women by 100 yards. Good heavens, that's almost the size of a baseball field from home plate to deep left field. Well, not deep left field, down the line in left field. That's how far the men were outdriving the women. It was just ridiculous. But you would never understand. Even though the women were hitting it far, they were hitting it far for women, which is a major qualifier. But the point is, it's real. They're playing on the same courses as men, but they're playing from tees that are 50 yards closer, 60 yards closer, 70 yards closer, things like that. And you're not really understanding that they're not actually playing the same game as the men because they're playing on a much, much smaller course. So maybe we could get some sanity back in the announcing. Maybe we could get some sanity back in sports. Maybe you could actually inject some sanity into feminism. Feminism has some good qualities. Yes, women need lots and lots of opportunities, but it's hard to say that there's any opportunity out there today that women don't have, that men have. So maybe we don't even need feminism at all. But these anecdotes of this big burly lumberjack guy in Canada going and dominating the women's weightlifting competition, I see hope in those things. They're obnoxious at first glance, and they make your blood boil at first glance, and then you realize, but they can also help open some people's eyes, and we can get rid of the nonsense that is feminism in sports and get back to some reality. That's all I have for now. That was just some musings that I thought were very interesting. And thanks for listening. Thanks for paying attention. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and please feel free to leave some comments down below. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on the matter. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on the matter. After all, this phenomenon of men taking part in women's sports and dominating women's sports is relatively new on the scene, so yes, I'd love to hear very much of what you're thinking and what you're saying. We try to put out a new video 5 days a week or so, maybe even 6 days, depends. Make sure to hit that notification bell and you'll learn whenever we put out a new one. And thanks again.